He was nobody. A grease-stained contract technician who clocked in before sunrise and never caused trouble. But when Callan Whitlock touched a helicopter component that shouldn't have passed inspection, he saw something that powerful men had paid enormous sums to keep hidden. He tried to stop the flight. They laughed at him. They called him paranoid. They put the CEO on board anyway, and 90 seconds after liftoff, the aircraft began to die. What happened next would destroy a corporation from the inside out, expose a conspiracy worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and force one quiet father to become the most dangerous thing he had ever been. If this kind of story keeps you on the edge of your seat, subscribe to our channel right now, hit that bell, so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, settle in, this one runs deep. The marsh smelled like low tide and diesel fuel that morning, the way it always did when the wind came in off the water and pushed everything back toward the shipyard. Callan Whitlock had been awake since 4:15. Not because his alarm went off, it had, but he'd already been lying there, staring at the ceiling when it did, listening to Harper's slow breathing through the wall of their small rental house and telling himself, for the 100th time, that he had made the right choice. He made coffee. Dark, no sugar. Drank it standing over the kitchen sink, watching the sky go from black to gray. Then he pulled on his work jacket, checked that his tools were where he'd packed them the night before, and drove to Aurelius Aerospace and Defense in the dark. He'd been doing this for 2 years and 4 months. Same route. Same parking spot near the east gate. Same nod to the overnight security guard whose name was Phil, who always looked like he hadn't slept and probably hadn't. Callan didn't talk much, and Phil appreciated that. Aurelius's South Carolina facility wasn't glamorous. It occupied a long stretch of reclaimed industrial land on the edge of the low-country coast, surrounded by marsh grass and chain-link fencings, and the kind of persistent salt air corrosion that ate at metal structures, no matter how often maintenance crews painted over it. The company built and serviced aerospace components, mostly defense contracts, some commercial work, and the facility's executive division maintained a small fleet of helicopters for corporate transport. That was Callan's section. 6 aircraft, 1 full-time crew. And Callan, the contract tech who came in early and stayed late, and never once asked to be included in anything beyond the work itself. He liked it that way. He liked that nobody here knew him, that he was just the quiet guy who kept his certifications current and never made mistakes. He reached his bench at 5:40, pulled on his gloves, and started where he'd left off the previous afternoon, the hydraulic control assembly on the executive helicopter, tail number AUR-7. Routine maintenance inspection, scheduled for completion before the aircraft flew executives to a board preview at the Charleston site the following week. He was an hour into it when he found the component. It was a hydraulic pressure regulator, a precisely engineered part that controlled fluid flow to the tail rotor assembly. Callan had replaced units like this dozens of times. He knew what a legitimate part looked like: the serial prefix, the certification stamps, the material tracing numbers that tied the component to a verified manufacturing batch. This one was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not wrong in any way that would trip a casual inspection or even most detailed ones. But Callan's hands had worked on enough of these systems over enough years that when something didn't feel right, when a serial prefix started with a digit sequence he didn't recognize, when certification documentation looked slightly too clean, when an acceptance test completion date was stamped at a time that was logistically impossible given standard lab protocols, he noticed. He held the part under his bench light for a long time. Then he set it down and pulled out his phone and started running the serial number against the manufacturer's database. The search returned nothing. He tried an alternate registry. Still nothing. He sat with that for a moment. Then he walked to the parts locker and pulled the receiving documentation, the paperwork trail, that was supposed to follow every component from manufacturer to installation. The documents were in order. Every signature was there. The component had been received, logged, inspected, and approved. Callan looked at the approval signature. Then he looked at the timestamp. The physical inspection had been signed off 47 minutes after the part shipment arrived at the facility. The hydraulic regulator he was holding required a minimum 6-hour bench evaluation under Aurelius's own safety protocols. Someone had approved it in less than an hour. He photographed everything: the part, the documentation, the serial number, the approval signature. He wrote up a formal discrepancy report on the internal maintenance system, flagged it as a safety hold, and sent it to his direct supervisor, A broad-shouldered man named Terry Grouse, who had been with Aurelius for 12 years and had the permanent squint of someone who had seen too many things he wished he hadn't. Terry came to his bench 20 minutes later. He stood there with his arms crossed, looking at the regulator, looking at the documentation Callan had laid out, and saying nothing for longer than was comfortable.
"Where'd you pull this from?"
Terry finally said. "Portside hydraulic assembly. Right where the receiving log says it was installed. And you're thinking the cert documents are off." "I'm not thinking anything," Callan said. "I'm telling you the serial prefix doesn't return in any manufacturer registry I can access, and a 6-hour bench eval was signed in under 50 minutes. That's not a judgment call. That's a factual discrepancy." Terry picked up the regulator, turned it over in his hands. Set it back down carefully, like it might be listening. "You run this by Sabine?" he asked. Sabine Mercer was the facility's lead safety engineer, technically a different chain of command from the maintenance floor, though in practice she and the tech crew overlapped constantly. She was sharp, thorough, and had a particular talent for asking questions that nobody wanted to answer. "Not yet," Callan said. "Came to you first." Terry nodded slowly. Then he looked away from the part and looked directly at Callan, and something shifted in his expression that Callan recognized immediately. It was the look of a man who had already done the calculation and arrived at an answer he didn't like. "Callan, this component has already been approved. Full review, signed off by the division safety coordinator. Going back at this now, the people who signed off on it, they're not going to thank you. I'm not looking for thanks. I know that." Terry's voice dropped. "I'm telling you that the approval came from above the facility level. This isn't something I can quietly kick back up the chain without it becoming a thing. And right now, with the board review coming and corporate looking at this location for a potential consolidation," he stopped, shook his head. "Just be sure you're right before you push this." "I'm sure enough to flag it," Callan said. "That's what the protocol requires." Terry looked at him for a moment longer. Then he nodded once and walked away without another word. Callan watched him go. Then he looked back at the helicopter. The report sat in the internal system without response for most of the morning. At 11:40, Callan received an automated notification that his safety flag had been reviewed and marked as resolved. No explanation, no response to the specific discrepancies he'd documented. Resolved. He stared at the notification for a while. Then he printed 2 copies of his original report, put one in his locker, and drove the other copy to the facility's document retention office and submitted it as a physical record. The clerk there, a young woman named Priya, who clearly thought this was an unusual thing for a technician to do, scanned it, stamped it, and handed him a receipt. He kept the receipt. At 2:30, the corporate helicopters came in. Callan heard them from the Floor 2 aircraft, arriving from the Charleston facility, settling onto the executive pad, with the efficient precision of pilots who were paid well to make everything look effortless. He stepped outside as the rotors wound down, more from habit than curiosity. He always oriented himself when aircraft moved on the ground. Old instinct. He saw her immediately. Evelina Thorne was 30 years old, and she ran Aurelius Aerospace and Defense with the kind of controlled intensity that made people around her either sharpen up or quietly find somewhere else to work. She was dressed practically for a facility visit, dark trousers, flat shoes, the kind of jacket that could go from a hangar floor to a boardroom without looking wrong in either place. She moved quickly, already in conversation with the man beside her, already pulling out a tablet. Sterling Bancroft was the COO, and he looked the part in every possible way, tall, sharply dressed, carrying himself with the particular ease of someone who had never in his professional life been made to feel unwelcome in any room. He was 51 years old and had the kind of face that read as distinguished until you looked at his eyes, which were busy and calculating and never quite landed on the same thing twice. Callan watched them cross the executive pad toward the facility entrance. He had 17 seconds before they disappeared inside. He made a decision, Mr. Bancroft. He crossed the pad at a deliberate pace. "Miss Thorne, I'm Callan Whitlock, contract tech for the Executive Aviation Division. I need 30 seconds of your time." Sterling turned first. He looked Callan over the way someone might look at an obstacle that had appeared in an otherwise clear corridor. "This isn't a good time," Sterling said pleasantly. "I understand. I've flagged a safety discrepancy on AUR-7, the aircraft scheduled for your departure today. The flag was resolved without a formal response to the specific issues I documented. I have a copy of the original report if which aircraft," Evelina said. "AUR-7, portside hydraulic assembly, the pressure regulator on." "The 7 is cleared for flight," Sterling said. "Our safety division reviewed it this morning. I appreciate you being thorough, but this has been handled. With respect, the discrepancy I flagged involves a component certification that, Mr. Whitlock." Sterling's voice stayed pleasant. It never lost its pleasant register, which somehow made it worse. "Our maintenance protocols involve multiple levels of qualified review. I'm going to trust that process over a flag from a contract technician who, I imagine, doesn't have complete visibility into our certification supply chain. Appreciate the diligence. We're in a hurry." He turned away. Evelina was still looking at Callan. Something in her face was harder to read than Bancroft's easy dismissal. There was assessment in it, but also the weight of a schedule and pressure points he couldn't see from where he was standing.
"Your report's on file?"
She said. "Yes, ma'am. Document retention copy as well." She nodded once. Then she followed Sterling inside. Callan stood on the executive pad and watched the door close behind them. He went back to his bench. There was nothing else to do. The aircraft had been cleared. His report had been acknowledged and dismissed. He was a contract technician. He had followed protocol exactly as required. He picked up his tools and tried to focus on a separate inspection task, but his hands kept pausing and his eyes kept going back to the hydraulic assembly on the bench. Across from him, the one he'd removed from AUR-7, which now sat beside a replacement that had been authorized before his flag was ever reviewed. An hour later, he heard them boarding. He set down his tools and walked to the hangar doors. The executive helicopter, his helicopter, the one he had touched that morning, the one carrying a hydraulic pressure regulator with a serial number that returned nothing in any database he could access, was spooling up on the executive pad. The rotor wash pushed flat against the marsh grass. Darius Cole was in the left seat. Callan had worked around Darius for 2 years. Darius was 63 years old, built like someone who had spent his entire life in cockpits, and he had more accumulated flight hours than anyone at the facility by a significant margin. Evelina Thorne boarded. Sterling Bancroft boarded. 2 assistants boarded. The helicopter lifted. It rose over the shipyard in the clean, controlled way that a properly maintained aircraft rises, hydraulics working in their design sequence, tail rotor compensating, the whole mechanical organism doing exactly what it was built to do. Callan watched it climb. He tracked the sound the way he had tracked the sound of aircraft for more years than he cared to count. 90 seconds after liftoff, something changed in the rotor note. It was subtle. Not the kind of thing you would catch if you weren't listening for it. But Callan was always listening. And the change he heard was not a fluctuation of wind or atmospheric variance or the normal acoustic shift of an aircraft transitioning to forward flight. It was the sound of a hydraulic system beginning to fight itself. His face changed. He was already moving before he understood he was moving. Inside the helicopter, Darius felt it first through the pedals. The tail rotor response was sluggish. Not dramatically, not yet, but sluggish in a way that every experienced pilot recognized as the first sign of a problem that was about to stop being subtle. He checked his hydraulic pressure gauges. The reading was low and dropping steadily. AUR-7 to Aurelius ground, declaring hydraulic abnormality, returning to field. His voice was flat and controlled because it had to be. In the passenger cabin, Evelina looked up from her tablet at the change in pitch. Sterling put his hand on the armrest. Neither of them said anything. Darius had 300 feet of altitude, a compromised hydraulic system, a full passenger load, and below him, the densely packed facility. Workshops, storage tanks, fuel infrastructure. He had seconds to make a decision that would be analyzed for years afterward. He looked left. Beyond the eastern perimeter, past the security fence, there was a stretch of cleared industrial land, a decommissioned lot that had been graded flat for a construction project that had never started. Roughly a quarter-mile away, over the populated facility. He made the call. He put the aircraft into a shallow banking turn that would take them over the most heavily occupied part of the yard, accepting that risk for himself in order to get them away from it. The hydraulic response was deteriorating fast now. The controls were becoming heavy. He was flying through resistance, fighting for every degree of yaw. The cleared lot appeared ahead. Darius put the helicopter down. Not beautifully. Not cleanly. He put it down the way you put an aircraft down when the systems you need are failing, and the ground is rising to meet you faster than you want, and your only job is to keep everyone alive. The aircraft struck the ground at an angle, the left skid collapsing, the fuselage grinding sideways across the hard-packed dirt, the main rotor blade separating in sequence and cartwheeling across the lot. The cockpit crumpled against a concrete drainage berm. The passenger cabin twisted but held. Smoke began rising immediately. Back at the facility, Callan was already running. The smoke column was already visible from the east gate by the time Callan cleared the perimeter fence. He hadn't taken a vehicle. There was no time to pull a key from the board and navigate the yard traffic that was already beginning to lock up, as workers streamed toward windows and doorways to see what had happened. He ran. Across the maintenance apron, past the parts warehouse, through the gap in the inner security fence where the inspection road cut toward the eastern boundary. His boots hit the hard-packed dirt of the access road, and he kept his pace steady, not sprinting, because sprinting burned out your legs before you got there, and he didn't know yet how much he'd need them when he arrived. He ran the way he had been trained to run toward things other people ran away from. Behind him, he could hear the facility's emergency alarm beginning to cycle. He could hear the first radio calls breaking over the maintenance channel on the portable clipped to his belt. He could hear, underneath all of that, the distant sound of the crash site, settling the particular mechanical groaning of a compromised airframe, finding its final resting position, a sound that had a weight to it that no amount of ambient noise could fully cover. He crossed 160 yards of open ground in under 2 minutes. When the lot came into view, his brain started processing automatically, cataloging everything, before he'd consciously decided what to look at. The helicopter had come down on its left side, the fuselage canted at roughly 30 degrees, the cockpit section compressed against the concrete drainage berm at the lot's north edge. Both main rotor blades had separated, one was buried in the dirt 40 feet from the aircraft. The other was nowhere immediately visible, which meant it had traveled and he needed to stay aware of where it might be. The tail section had folded back on itself, which was structurally catastrophic, but also meant the tail rotor was disabled and not spinning. That was one less immediate danger. Fuel. That was the priority. He read the wind first, coming from the southwest at roughly 10 knots, steady. He looked at the ground beneath the aircraft. Dark staining spreading from the underside of the fuselage, moving with the slight grade of the lot toward the northeast, toward the drainage berm, away from the aircraft's nose, which was where the engine compartment was, where the heat was. For now, the fuel was flowing away from the fire risk. For now. The engine wasn't fully out. He could see orange light flickering inside the cowling vent on the starboard side, contained but alive, and he knew from experience that contained and alive was a temporary condition when fuel was involved. He had maybe 4 minutes before the equation changed, possibly less. He reached the aircraft. The main cabin door port side, which should have been the accessible side, had been driven partially into the dirt by the impact angle. The door frame was warped, the handle mechanism visibly buckled. He grabbed it anyway and pulled with everything he had. The door shifted 3 inches and stopped. He moved. He went around the nose of the aircraft, ducking under the compressed cockpit section, checking Darius through the fractured windscreen as he passed. The pilot was slumped against his harness, head forward, not moving, but breathing. Callan could see the chest rise and fall even in the bad light inside the cockpit. He noted the position, noted the way the cockpit had compressed around the left seat versus the right, and kept moving. There was a second point of entry that most people didn't know existed on this helicopter model, an emergency egress panel built into the aft fuselage wall on the starboard side, designed to be accessible from outside in exactly these circumstances. It was not advertised. It was not in the standard passenger safety briefing. It was in the maintenance documentation that Callan had read carefully when he started on the executive fleet, because he read all the documentation carefully, because that was who he was. He found the panel. It was partially obstructed by a section of the tail structure that had folded forward, but not blocked. He could reach the release mechanism if he got his arm in at the right angle. He knelt in the dirt, pressed himself against the fuselage, and worked the release with his right hand while the heat from the starboard engine cowling pressed against his left shoulder like a warning. The panel came free. Smoke moved through the opening immediately, not thick, not yet, but acrid and chemical, and the kind that told you things were progressing inside, that you couldn't see from out here. He pulled his jacket up over his nose, took a breath of the outside air, and went in. The interior of the cabin was disorienting. The canted angle of the fuselage meant that what had been the floor was now partially a wall, and the seats that should have been oriented horizontally were cocked sideways, and the 2 assistants who had boarded behind Sterling were tangled in their harnesses on what was now the low side of the cabin. Both conscious, both making sounds that told him they were hurt but not critically. Sterling Bancroft was wedged against the far side of the cabin, one arm braced against the overhead paneling, breathing hard. There was blood on his face from a gash above his left eyebrow. He looked at Callan without immediate recognition. "Can you move?" Callan said. Sterling blinked.
Nice.
"I think then move. Egress panel, aft starboard wall, right behind you." "Go now." Sterling moved. Callan didn't watch him go. He was already scanning forward. Evelina Thorne had been in the forward-most passenger seat, the one closest to the cockpit bulkhead. The impact had driven that section of the cabin the hardest, and her seat had partially collapsed on its track mount, pitching her forward into the shoulder harness at an angle that wasn't right. Her head was down. Her arms were loose. He got to her. He put 2 fingers against the side of her neck. The pulse was there fast, a little irregular, but present. He checked her airway visually, checked the position of her head and neck. There was no obvious deformity, no grotesque angle that told him her spine was compromised, but there was swelling beginning along her right temple, and he couldn't rule out a concussion or worse. He reached for the harness release. "Don't," he said, mostly to himself, mostly because he knew what he was about to do was going to hurt her even under the best conditions, and there was nothing he could do about that. This is going to be rough. He released the harness. He got his left arm under her shoulders and his right supporting her head and neck, keeping her spine in as neutral a position as he could manage inside a canted aircraft cabin that smelled increasingly of fuel and hot metal, and he began moving her toward the egress panel. She was a slight person, but dead weight was dead weight, and the angle was wrong, and at one point his right knee went down into the edge of a broken seat track, and he felt the metal bite through his work trousers into the meat of his knee, and he kept moving anyway, because stopping was not an option. Outside was better. Outside he could breathe. He got her through the egress panel and got himself through behind her and stood up in the open air with Evelina Thorne in his arms and his knee bleeding into his boot. The fuel staining had spread another 6 feet. He started walking, then pushed himself into something closer to a run, covering ground fast in a direction the wind would carry them away from whatever came next. 70 yards. 80. He picked a point that felt like enough, and he put her down on the ground carefully on her back, and he knelt beside her and kept his hand at the back of her neck to support it, and he looked back at the wreck. The fire in the starboard engine cowling was no longer contained. It found the fuel. The sound was not the dramatic explosion that people imagine from movies. It was a heavy concussive thud followed immediately by a sustained roar, and then the heat arrived like a physical wall. And the wreckage that Callan had crawled through 45 seconds earlier was engulfed in a column of orange flame that rose 30 feet into the marsh air. He turned back to Evelina. Her eyes were opening. They were unfocused at first, the dazed, trying to locate herself look of someone coming back from somewhere dark, and then they found his face, and something in them sharpened. She tried to say something. What came out was not quite a word. "Don't move," Callan said. "You're out of the aircraft. You're on the ground. You're going to be all right, but don't move until the medical crew gets to you." She looked at him. Then she looked past him at the fire and the smoke and the ruined shape of what had been a functioning aircraft 20 minutes ago. She looked back at him. She said, her voice rough and damaged, "You're the mechanic." "Yes. You tried to stop, don't talk yet." Behind him, he could hear the emergency crews arriving, the crunch of tires on the gravel access road, the warbling of a fire unit, shouted coordinations between responders, who were doing their jobs under pressure and doing them reasonably well, but who had arrived at a scene that was already managed. Callan stood up, turned to face them, and began directing traffic with a calm, flat authority that stopped the first responders in their tracks for half a second before they processed what they were hearing and started following instructions. Pilot is still in the cockpit. Left seat, conscious, possible spinal involvement from the impact angle. Do not move him without full stabilization protocol. 2 additional passengers extracted through the aft egress panel. I don't have a full assessment on either of them, but they were ambulatory. The woman on the ground behind me is the priority. She's been unconscious. Possible head trauma. I've been supporting cervical throughout. Get aboard under her. The paramedic team lead a compact woman in her 40s with short gray hair, and the no-nonsense manner of someone who had been doing this job for 20 years, looked at him steadily. "Who are you?" "Contract tech from the facility. I extracted the passenger." She glanced at his knee. The blood had soaked through his trousers and was making a mess of his boot, and then she looked at his face, which was composed and direct, and not particularly interested in discussing his knee. "All right," she said, "walk me through it." He did. He was still walking her through it when the military vehicles arrived. He heard them before he saw them, the distinctive engine note of heavy transport vehicles moving fast on the access road, the kind of vehicles that didn't belong to any civilian emergency service. Two of them came around the eastern bend of the lot, olive drab and purposeful, and behind them a third vehicle that was smaller and faster, and had clearly been leading the convoy until the lead vehicles slowed. A Navy base sat 11 miles inland. Callan knew it was there. He had been aware of it since the day he took the job at Aurelius. In the same way, he was aware of all the relevant geography of wherever he lived, which was something he did automatically and without thinking about it. What he had not accounted for was that the base would scramble personnel to a civilian aviation incident this quickly, or that among those personnel would be anyone who knew his face. The smaller vehicle stopped 20 feet from where Callan was standing. The man who got out was built like a piece of load-bearing architecture, wide shoulders, thick neck, the kind of physical density that came from decades of maintaining a body that was expected to function under extreme conditions. He was wearing working utilities, and he had the rank insignia of a Master Chief Petty Officer on his collar, and he moved across the dirt with the ground-eating stride of someone who was very used to arriving at bad situations. He was moving toward Evelina. Callan understood that she was the CEO of a major defense contractor, and the Navy had reason to care about her well-being, and he stepped slightly to the side to let the man through. The Master Chief's eyes swept the scene in the automatic way of trained personnel doing an immediate assessment. They passed over the paramedic team, over Evelina on the board, over the burning wreckage, over the other response personnel. Then they landed on Callan. The Master Chief stopped walking. He stopped the way a man stops when he has seen something that his brain is processing as impossible and his body is frozen while the processing catches up. He stood there in the middle of the industrial lot, with the fire throwing heat waves across the air between them, and he looked at Callan's face with an expression that moved through disbelief into something rawer. "No," he said, "just that, just the word," to himself. Callan looked at him. Master Chief Ronan Vale. Callan recognized him immediately, though it had been 4 years and Vale had gone gray at the temples, and there were lines in his face that hadn't been there before. They had served together for 6 years. They had been in 8 countries together, in conditions that didn't have good names. Callan had trusted this man with things he had trusted to very few people. Vale crossed the remaining distance in 4 strides. He stopped in front of Callan, and the two of them stood there for a moment, in the noise and heat and controlled chaos of the crash site, and something passed between them that was too compressed and complicated to be called an emotion. Exactly, but was made up of several of them. Then Ronan Vale did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He straightened. Not dramatically, not as a performance. It was automatic, the way the body sometimes does what the training tells it to do before the conscious mind has finished deciding. He straightened, and his chin came up slightly, and his hands moved to his sides. "Commander Whitlock, sir." The words were quiet. They were not meant to carry. But the paramedic team lead heard them, and 2 of her crew heard them, and Sterling Bancroft, who had been sitting on the ground 20 feet away with a compress against his forehead, heard them. And Evelina Thorne, who had her eyes open, and was tracking everything with the focused intensity of someone who was hurt but not gone, heard them. Callan held Vale's gaze for a moment. Then he said quietly enough that it didn't travel, "Ronan." Vale's jaw tightened. "You're bleeding, I know. What are you doing here? At this facility, I mean. What are you?" He stopped. Looked at Callan's work jacket, at the Aurelius logo on the chest. "You're a contractor here. Contract Tech, Aviation Systems." Vale processed this with the expression of a man who was doing significant internal work to keep his face neutral. "You pulled her out. Her and 2 others. Pilot still in the cockpit. Your people need to coordinate with the paramedic team on extraction." Vale turned immediately and started issuing instructions to the personnel who had come with him, because he was Ronan Vale, and that was what he did. Callan watched him work and felt something he didn't have a clean name for, not quite grief, not quite relief, somewhere in the geography between the two. He became aware that someone was looking at him. He turned. Evelina was watching him from the backboard. They were lifting her now, preparing to move her to the ambulance unit that had come in behind the fire trucks, and she had maybe 15 seconds before she was out of his line of sight. She was watching him with the same assessing look she'd given him on the executive pad 2 hours earlier, but there was nothing detached about it now. There was something in her expression that he recognized because he had seen it on people's faces before, in various places and conditions, the particular look of someone recalibrating everything they thought they knew about a situation. He met her eyes. She said something, but the noise of the sight swallowed it. He couldn't hear the words. Then she was in the ambulance, and the doors were closing, and she was gone. Callan stood where he was. His knee had gone from hurting to a persistent throb that he was managing by not thinking about it directly. The fire in the wreckage was coming down under the suppression foam that the fire crew had deployed. The scene was organized. Now the responders had their assignments and were working them, and the kind of chaos that had existed 20 minutes ago had settled into the controlled urgency of professionals doing what they were trained to do. He had done what he could do here. He looked at the wreckage for a moment, at the burned-out shape of AUR-7, the aircraft he had touched that morning with careful hands, the aircraft whose hydraulic system had carried a component he had flagged and been told was fine. The aircraft whose regulator had failed 90 seconds into a flight carrying 5 people, including the company's CEO, including a pilot who had made an extraordinary decision to put everyone else's safety above his own chances, and was now being carefully extracted from a compressed cockpit 11 minutes after impact, alive but not uninjured, never going to be entirely the same. Callan thought about that acceptance test signature, about the 47-minute approval, about the way Sterling Bancroft's voice had stayed pleasant, while he dismissed a safety concern that turned out to be, in fact, a safety concern. His report was still on file. The physical copy was in document retention, with a time-stamped receipt in his locker. He hadn't been wrong. He reached down and pulled the fabric of his work trousers away from the wound on his knee, checking the depth. Ugly but manageable. He had worked through worse. He straightened up. Ronan Vale appeared at his shoulder, close enough to speak without raising his voice. "You need that looked at. In a minute. Callan." Vale's voice had dropped into something that wasn't rank or protocol, just one person talking to another. 11 years. And nobody here knew, nobody here needed to know. Vale was quiet for a moment. The fire crew moved between them briefly and then cleared again. "The girl Harper. She's good? She's 13 and she thinks I'm boring," Callan said. "She's good." Something moved across Vale's face that might have been a smile if it had made it all the way. "You should have told me you were in the area." "I know." I would have. Vale stopped. Looked at the ground. Looked back up. "Why this? Contract tech work. Why here?" Callan looked at what remained of AUR-7. At the foam-covered skeleton of an aircraft that had carried a fraudulent part approved by someone with something to protect, something to gain, or both. "'Cause the work matters," he said. "When it's done right." Vale didn't say anything to that. He understood it. Callan could see that he understood it. And he was decent enough not to dress it up with anything additional. A younger Navy petty officer jogged up to Vale with something that needed his attention, and Vale turned to deal with it, and Callan was alone again in the way he was usually alone present in a crowd, invisible in plain sight. He looked toward the facility. There would be investigators. There would be Federal Safety Board personnel and corporate security and probably lawyers arriving by tomorrow morning. There would be pressure, and there would be questions, and there would be a very organized effort to understand what had happened. And, depending on what powerful people needed the answer to be, perhaps also to shape what had happened into something manageable. The physical copy of his report was in document retention. The receipt was in his locker. The hydraulic regulator he had pulled from AUR-7 that morning was sitting on his bench because he had flagged it and removed it, and it had been replaced with the component that was now part of a federal crash investigation. Callan looked at his hands, fuel residue and soot, and the brown stain of his own blood from his knee. He thought about Harper waiting at home, about the way she looked up from her homework when he came through the door, that automatic look, the one she probably didn't know she did, checking that he was there, checking that he was whole. He had time to get home before she finished dinner. He turned away from the wreckage and walked back toward the facility. Behind him, what remained of AUR-7 steamed quietly under the afternoon sky, and 11 miles away, in a regional trauma center, Evelina Thorne was being assessed by doctors who would tell her she was fortunate, which was true, though it left out the more specific truth that her fortune had a name and wore a work jacket with grease on the cuffs and bled from his knee without mentioning it to anyone. The federal investigators arrived the next morning in 2 rental sedans and a van with government plates, which meant they had driven from the regional field office rather than flown in, which meant they had been mobilized sometime in the previous evening rather than the middle of the night, which told Callan something about how the initial incident classification had been framed. Not an emergency, an investigation. There was a difference in urgency and a difference in what kinds of questions got asked first. He watched them come through the east gate from his bench, where he had arrived at 5:40 as usual, because no one had told him not to, and he had learned long ago that the most reliable way to maintain access to a situation was to behave as though you belonged in it. His knee was wrapped and functional. He had cleaned up the wound the previous evening, explained the torn trousers to Harper as a slip on a wet floor, and watched her look at him with the particular expression she had inherited from her mother, the one that said she didn't entirely believe him, but was choosing not to press it. She had made him sit at the kitchen table and eat dinner, and tell her 3 true things about his day, which was a game they had been playing since she was 7. He told her the facility had an accident, that nobody had died, and that the marsh grass smelled like rain coming in. He left the rest where it belonged. Now he was at his bench with a cup of cold coffee and a clear view of the executive pad and the access road, and he was thinking about the hydraulic regulator that was still sitting in an evidence bag in the facility's secure part storage, and about the 11 other aircraft in Aurelius's fleet that he had not yet had the opportunity to inspect. Terry Grouse appeared at the bench at 7:15, looking like he hadn't slept. "They're going to want to talk to you," Terry said without preamble. "I know, the federal people." Terry sat on the edge of a rolling stool without being invited, and corporate security, and probably Bancroft's office, though I don't know in what order. That's fine. Terry looked at his hands. He had a habit when he was uncomfortable of looking at his hands, as if checking that they were still there. "What you did yesterday, pulling her out and the others." That was, he stopped, tried again. "Most people ran the other way. Most people were right to," Callan said. "There's no upside to running toward a burning aircraft if you don't know what you're doing. And you knew what you were doing." Callan drank his cold coffee and said nothing. Terry studied him for a moment with the look of a man who was revising a long-held assumption. "Ronan Vale, the Master Chief. He called you Commander." "He did." "You were Navy." "I was. For how long?" "Long enough." Callan set down his cup. "Terry, I need access to the maintenance records for the rest of the executive fleet. All 6 aircraft, full hydraulic system documentation, parts provenance going back 18 months. Terry stared at him. "Callan, I know what I'm asking. I know it's complicated right now. But if the part that failed on AUR-7 came through the same procurement channel as components on the other aircraft, then we have a larger problem than one crash. That's for the federal investigators, too. The federal investigators are going to spend the next three weeks establishing jurisdiction and reviewing documentation that has already been through at least one set of hands that wanted it to say something." Specific Callan's voice was even and not unkind. "I can read maintenance records. That's actually what I'm here for. Let me do the job." Terry was quiet for a long time. Outside, a corporate security vehicle moved slowly past the hangar entrance, circling the yard with the deliberate visibility of people who wanted to be seen circling. "I'll see what I can pull," Terry said finally. No promises on timing. He left. Callan went back to waiting. The federal interview happened at 10 in the morning in a conference room in the facility's administrative building, which was a beige room with a long table and a view of the parking lot and a persistent smell of burned coffee that no amount of ventilation had ever fully addressed. There were 2 investigators, a man named Fitch who did most of the talking, and a woman named Yeo who took notes and occasionally asked a question that was more precisely aimed than anything Fitch had produced. Callan told them the truth, all of it. The anomalous serial prefix, the certification documentation, the impossible acceptance test timeline, the report he had filed, the flag that had been resolved without response, the document retention copy, the receipt in his locker. He told them about approaching Sterling and Evelina on the executive pad. He told them what Sterling had said. Fitch listened with the careful neutrality of someone professionally trained to give nothing away. "And your background in aviation systems, where did that come from?" "Military service. Naval aviation support and systems, primarily rotary wing."
"How long?"
11 years. Fitch made a note. "Your rank when you separated." Callan looked at him steadily. "Commander." The pause that followed was brief but present. Fitch and Yeo exchanged a glance that carried the compressed communication of 2 people who had been working together long enough to have a shorthand. "The Master Chief who arrived with the base personnel yesterday," Yeo said. "Vale. He knew you. We served together, and he addressed you as Commander." "Old habit," Callan said. "It's been 4 years." Yeo wrote something down. Fitch moved on. They kept him for 2 hours. When they finished, Fitch told him not to leave the state without notification, which Callan acknowledged without expression, and Yeo gave him a card with a direct line and told him to call if he thought of anything additional. He thanked her and left the room. In the corridor outside, he nearly walked into Sabine Mercer. She was moving fast, carrying a laptop bag and a paper cup of something that had sloshed over the rim and left a damp ring on her palm, and she pulled up short when she saw him with the startled look of someone who had been inside her own head. Sabine Mercer was 44 years old, lean in the way of someone who forgot to eat when she was working, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of permanent slight frown that wasn't unhappiness, but concentration, the expression of a mind that was always running calculations in the background. She had been Aurelius's lead safety engineer for 6 years. Callan had worked around her professionally for 2 years and had a clear opinion of her competence, which was high, and of her willingness to step on difficult ground to do her job, which was also high, though he had not had reason to test that particular quality directly until now. "Whitlock," she said, "I was looking for you. I just came out of Federal. I know, I'm next." She looked past him at the conference room door, then back at his face. "I need to talk to you before I go in there." "All right." She steered him down the corridor to a stretch of wall, away from the administrative assistant's desk, where she dropped her voice. "I pulled the procurement records for AUR-7's hydraulic assembly last night," she said, "after I heard what you'd flagged. I have access, it's my lane, and I wanted to see the chain before Federal locked it down." "What did you find?" "The regulator that was installed. The supplier is a company called Trident Dynamics Components out of Georgia. Small shop, maybe 40 employees. They've been an Aurelius-approved vendor for about 14 months. She paused. "You know what I couldn't find?" Callan waited. "Any record of the initial safety flag you filed making it into the permanent maintenance database." She watched his face. "Your report exists in the interim system, the one you file to before it gets reviewed and transferred. It never transferred. The resolution that came back to you, the one that said your flag had been reviewed, that resolution was entered from a director-level login, but the supporting documentation that should have been attached to any legitimate safety review, it's not there. The flag was closed out without the required review package. Who holds the director-level login that closed it?" Sabine's jaw tightened slightly. "The division safety coordinator. A man named Holt. He's been with the company 8 years. He reports directly to Bancroft's operational structure." Callan thought about that, about the gap between where a flag entered the system and where it was supposed to come out, about how cleanly and quietly a safety concern could be made to disappear if someone with the right system access decided it needed to disappear. "Have you told Federal this?" he said. "I'm about to. I wanted to tell you first," because she stopped. There was something in her expression that was not quite discomfort, but was in that neighborhood. "Because your flag is what started this, and it got closed out illegitimately, and you're a contract tech, which means you have about a quarter of the institutional protection I have if this gets ugly. I thought you should know what you're standing in before it gets more complicated." Callan looked at her. He had been working around Sabine Mercer for 2 years, and he had always thought she was good at her job. He was revising that assessment upward now. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once, sharp and businesslike, and then went into the conference room. Callan stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and texted Terry Grouse 4 words, "I need those records." The response came back 20 minutes later. "Tomorrow morning, bench, before 6. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was something. He was crossing back through the maintenance building toward his section when he became aware that he was being followed. Not overtly whoever it was, had some training or at least some instinct about distance and pace. But Callan had a well-developed sense of when someone was behind him, and the sense was active now, and had been since he turned into the corridor off the main floor. He kept walking. He turned into the parts storage vestibule, which had a secondary exit he knew about, and instead of taking it, he stopped behind the door and waited. The door opened 30 seconds later. The man who came through it was not someone Callan recognized, which in this environment meant he was not facility staff. He was mid-30s, fit, dressed in the business casual that was corporate security's preferred camouflage in facilities like this. He stopped when he found himself 2 feet from Callan in the vestibule. "You're following me," Callan said. The man's composure held, which was professional. "Mr. Whitlock, Mr. Bancroft would like a word. Mr. Bancroft knows where to find me." He thought a private conversation might be more comfortable for both parties. I'm sure he did. Callan looked at the man with the flat patience of someone who is not going to be hurried. Tell him I'm available during business hours. In the facility. With other people around. The man held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once and left. Callan stood in the vestibule and thought about that. About Sterling Bancroft, who had survived the crash with a gash above his eyebrow and was now apparently well enough to send people after contract technicians through back corridors. About what Sterling needed a private conversation to accomplish that he couldn't accomplish in front of other people. He thought about the document in his locker, the receipt from document retention. He went back to his bench. The call from the hospital came at 2:15. It was not from the hospital itself, it was from a private number, and the voice on the other end was Evelina Thorne's. She sounded different from the executive pad version of herself. Not diminished exactly something in her voice, still had structural integrity that was clearly characteristic, but the careful, professional surface was thinner. Possibly because she was calling from a hospital room, possibly because she had been unconscious on a piece of industrial ground 12 hours earlier, and that did things to a person's performance of themselves. "Mr. Whitlock," she said. "Miss Thorne, how are you feeling?" A beat, like I was in a helicopter crash. Brief, dry. He appreciated that. "I'm told you extracted me from the aircraft. You and 2 others. Your pilot is the one who should be getting phone calls. He made the decision that kept everyone alive." Darius's, she paused, and something shifted in her voice that told him this was not easy for her to say. Darius has 2 broken ribs, a fractured clavicle, and a significant concussion. They're keeping him overnight. He'll recover, they think. Good. I wanted to, she stopped. Tried a different approach. The federal investigators spoke to me this morning. They mentioned your safety report. The flag you filed yesterday morning. Yes. They mentioned it had been closed out without formal review. That's correct. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear the faint background sounds of a hospital room equipment, distant PA systems, the kind of ambient noise that made private conversations feel less private than they were. "Sterling told me this morning," she said carefully, "that your flag was reviewed and found to be a misidentification. He said the component was fully certified and that you had misread the serial prefix." Callan let that sit for a moment before he spoke. "I didn't misread anything," he said. "I photographed the component and the documentation before I filed the report. The photographs are on my phone with timestamps." Another pause. "Longer this time, Mr. Whitlock." Her voice had changed again. "Do you understand what I need you to be precise with me? Are you telling me that what you reported yesterday morning was accurate and that it was deliberately suppressed?" "I'm telling you that I filed an accurate report, that it was closed out without the required review documentation, and that the component I flagged failed in flight 14 hours later." He kept his voice level. "The investigators can establish causation. That's their job. My job was to flag the discrepancy, which I did." He heard her breathe out slowly through her nose. "Someone sent a man to follow me today," he said. "Wanted a private meeting with Sterling." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. "Don't take that meeting," she said. "I wasn't planning to." "And the photographs. The timestamps. Can you preserve those externally? Off-company systems?" "Already done." He heard something that might have been relief in the quality of her silence. "There's something else I need to ask you," she said. "The Master Chief. Vale, he called you Commander. He did, 11 years of military service, aviation systems, SEAL operations. She had done research, then either personally or through someone, in the hours since the crash. You walked away 4 years ago. I did. Why Aurelius? Why this facility? Why a contract tech position?" Callan looked out the hangar door at the eastern perimeter fence, at the marsh grass beyond it, moving in the steady coastal wind. "Because my daughter lives here," he said. "Because the work is real. Because it matters whether an aircraft is safe or not, regardless of what else is going on." He paused. "And because quiet is underrated." Evelina didn't say anything immediately. He had the sense she was processing something, not the words themselves, but something underneath them. "I'm going to be out of the hospital tomorrow," she said finally. "There are going to be board discussions this week. About the crash, about liability, about the investigation. Sterling is a brief stop. Sterling is already managing the narrative. I know, I need you to not." She stopped again. He had the impression she was choosing words with unusual care, which made him cautious. "I need you to trust that I'm handling certain things. Even if what you see in the next few days doesn't look like what you'd expect." He thought about that. About the careful phrasing. About what she wasn't saying directly. I'm going to keep doing my job, he said. That's all I'm asking. She ended the call. Callan put his phone away and sat with the conversation for a minute. Then he pulled out his laptop and started building a log. Every conversation time-stamped, every observation, every document he had touched, and every person he had spoken to. He was not a lawyer and he was not an investigator, but he understood documentation the way he understood maintenance records. The difference between what was true and what could be proven was almost always a paper trail, and paper trails were built by the people who understood that the present moment would eventually be someone else's past evidence. He was an hour into it when Terry appeared at the bench again, this time with the look of a man who had crossed a line he wasn't sure he should have crossed. I pulled what I could from the maintenance archives, Terry said quietly. Hydraulic system records, all 6 aircraft going back 20 months. It's on the shared drive in a folder I named it Bench Calibration Review, so it doesn't stand out. He looked at Callan with something complicated in his face. I'm not stupid, Callan. If there's more wrong with those aircraft than what happened yesterday, I want to know before someone else gets hurt. That's all I wanted to know, Callan said. Terry nodded. Started to leave, then stopped. Whatever you were before you came here, he said, you didn't lose it. He left before Callan could figure out what to say to that, which was probably the kindest way to do it. Callan opened the shared drive. The records were dense hundreds of entries, parts logs, inspection reports, technician sign-offs, supplier documentation going back nearly 2 years. He started reading. He read the way he did everything methodical, sequentially, completely, without skipping ahead, because the thing you were looking for was almost never where you expected it to be, and the only reliable search method was to start at the beginning and go through it all. He found the first anomaly in the 3rd aircraft's hydraulic records at 4:30. It was subtle, the same kind of subtle as the AUR-7 regulator had been subtle. A parts entry from Trident Dynamics components. A serial prefix that didn't match standard manufacturer formatting. An acceptance test completion time that was, again, physically impossible given the required bench protocols. He kept reading. He found the 2nd and the 4th aircraft's records 20 minutes later. Then a 3rd. Then a 4th. By the time the facility's day shift was ending and the ambient noise of the hangar was shifting from operational to shutdown, Callan had identified 7 additional hydraulic and components across 5 separate aircraft that showed the same pattern of anomalous certification as the part that had failed on AUR-7. 7 components, 5 aircraft. The same supplier. The same impossible test timelines. The same director-level approval signatures from the same Holt, closing out records that should have triggered additional review. He sat back and looked at what he had built on his screen. This was not a single bad part that had slipped through an overworked inspection process. This was a pattern, and a pattern required either catastrophic systemic failure, every check, every review, every qualified person looking at these parts simultaneously failing to catch what was wrong, or it required something more deliberate. He thought about what Sabine had told him, about Trident Dynamics components, about 14 months of approved vendor status, about the director-level login that had been closing out flags. He thought about Sterling Bancroft standing on the executive pad with his pleasant voice and his dismissive confidence, and about the way powerful men sometimes confused dismissiveness with control. He copied everything, every record, every anomaly he'd identified, every timestamp onto an encrypted external drive he kept in his tool case. Then he called Sabine Mercer. She picked up on the 2nd ring. I need you to look at something, he said. The fleet records, she said, and it was not a question, which told him she had been moving in the same direction. Yes, are you still at the facility? I'm in my office. I never left. He carried his laptop across the maintenance floor, through the connecting corridor, and into the safety engineering office, which was a corner room that Sabine had gradually colonized with filing cabinets and equipment, and the particular organized chaos of someone who worked across multiple ongoing investigations simultaneously. She was at her desk with 2 screens running and a half-eaten sandwich pushed to the corner that she had clearly been ignoring for hours. He showed her what he had found. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. She pulled up her own records and cross-referenced. She made marks on a legal pad, not notes exactly, more like a map she was building as she went. 7 components, she said finally, that I can identify with the access I have. There could be more. If the same approval pattern applies across all the Trident purchases, there are at least 4 additional units I flagged last month that were reviewed and cleared by Holt's login. She tapped her pen against the legal pad. I flagged them as anomalous but within acceptable variance. I didn't push it. I should have pushed it. There was something in her voice on those last 3 words that was not comfortable to hear. He didn't try to soften it, because she didn't need softening. She needed to know what she was looking at so she could decide what to do about it. 11 components total, he said, across at least 5 aircraft, all from the same supplier, all showing impossible certification timelines, all approved through the same login. Sabine put down her pen, looked at the screens. Then she looked at Callan with the expression of someone who had done the math and arrived at a number they wished they hadn't. If any of those aircraft fly before this is resolved, she said. Yes, Callan said. She picked up her phone. He watched her call the federal investigator's direct line. He watched her give her name and her title and the words safety critical finding, multiple aircraft, urgent, and he watched the quality of the voice on the other end change immediately in the way that official voices changed when something theoretical became concrete. While she was on the phone, Callan's own phone vibrated. A text from a number he didn't recognize, no name attached. It said, "You should know who benefits financially from Trident Dynamics contracts with Aurelius. Check the holding companies. Start with Meridian Capital Partners." He looked at the text for a long time. Then he forwarded it to the timestamped log he had been building all afternoon, screenshotted it with the metadata intact, and added it to the external drive. He didn't know yet who had sent it, but someone inside Aurelius, someone with access that went deeper than a maintenance floor, was either trying to help him or trying to direct him somewhere convenient. He had learned a long time ago that the difference between those two things was not always obvious from the message itself. It was obvious from what you found when you went where the message pointed. He intended to find out. Sabine finished her call and set down her phone with the particular stillness of someone who had just committed to a course of action they couldn't reverse. "Federal is coming back tomorrow with expanded scope," she said. "They're issuing a precautionary hold on the fleet pending review. Good, Holt is going to be called in. Also good." She looked at him across the desk. "Sterling is going to know by morning that this has expanded. He's going to move fast, I know." "You're a contract tech," she said. Not harshly, just stating the fact the way facts sometimes needed to be stated. "Contract gets pulled. You're out. You don't have the same protections I do. Or Evelina does." "I know that too," Callan said. "So what do you want to do?" He looked at the screens. At 11 aircraft records spread across 2 monitors, at a pattern that had been sitting in Aurelius's maintenance database for 14 months while 5 aircraft flew, and nobody who had the authority to stop them had decided to look hard enough. "Keep going," he said. "Find all of it. Get it documented and preserved before anyone has the opportunity to make it go away." Sabine looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled the sandwich over and took a bite, because she had apparently decided that she was going to be here a while and she might as well eat. "All right," she said, still chewing. "Pull up the Trident purchasing records. Let's start from the beginning." The Meridian Capital Partners thread took Sabine 4 hours to pull apart, and when she finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment without speaking, which told Callan more about what she had found than any immediate summary would have. It was past midnight. The facility was empty except for the overnight security rotation and the 2 of them in the safety engineering office, which had accumulated over the course of the evening, the particular atmosphere of a room where serious work had been happening for 2 long empty cups, papers spread in overlapping layers, the blue light of monitors casting everything in a flat, shadowless quality that made people look slightly unwell. Sabine lowered her gaze from the ceiling and looked at her screen. "Meridian Capital Partners is a private investment holding company registered in Delaware," she said. "It holds equity positions in 11 aerospace and defense supply chain companies. One of those companies is a manufacturing group called Vantage Industrial Holdings." She paused. Vantage Industrial Holdings is the parent company of Trident Dynamics Components. Callan was quiet. "Meridian's ownership structure is layered," Sabine continued. 2 intermediate holding entities before you get to individual beneficial ownership. But the beneficial ownership disclosure, which is public record under federal registration requirements, buried in a filing from 16 months ago that nobody was looking for, lists 3 individuals. She turned the monitor slightly so he could read the screen. The second name on that list is a trust, the Bancroft Family Trust. The name sat in the air of the office. Callan looked at the filing on the screen. He looked at the date 16 months ago, 2 months before Trident Dynamics was approved as an Aurelius vendor. "Sterling didn't just allow the parts through," Callan said. "No," Sabine said. Every Trident Dynamics contract that Aurelius signed went money through Vantage, through Meridian, and a percentage of that landed in a trust that his family controls. He wasn't just cutting corners to save delivery costs. She pressed her fingers flat against the desk. He was selling his own company defective parts and collecting a return on the sale. The clarity of it was almost stunning. Not complex, the opposite of complex. A simple, ugly arrangement that had been dressed up in enough corporate layers to be invisible unless you were specifically looking for it, and almost nobody would have been specifically looking for it because almost nobody knew to look. Except someone had known. Someone had sent Callan that text message pointing him toward Meridian Capital Partners, and that someone had done it knowing what he would find when he got there. He told Sabine about the text. She read it when he showed her the screenshot. Her expression was controlled, but her jaw tightened slightly. You don't know who sent it? No. Could be someone inside the company who's been sitting on this and needed a way to surface it without exposure. That's what I think. Could also be someone who wants this information in circulation for reasons that aren't entirely about aviation safety. That's also possible, Callan said. Either way, the information is accurate. We found it through legitimate records access. How we were pointed toward it doesn't change what it is. Sabine nodded slowly. She had the expression of someone filing something under things to return to later, which was the right call given everything else currently in motion. They spent another hour organizing what they had: the procurement records, the certification anomalies, the approval trail through Holt's login, the Meridian ownership structure, the financial disclosures. Sabine created a structured evidence package with source documentation for everything and transferred it to outside counsel. She had a direct relationship with a firm that did regulatory compliance work for Aurelius, and that she had quietly contacted an hour earlier using her personal phone to establish that she was acting in a capacity that fell under professional protection. She was not naive about what was coming. Callan drove home at 1:15 in the morning. Harper was asleep. He stood in her doorway for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe before he went to his own room and lay down without fully undressing and stared at the ceiling. He thought about what Evelina had said on the phone, about trusting her, about things not looking like what he'd expect. He thought about Sterling Bancroft's pleasant voice. He thought about 11 compromised aircraft components and 5 helicopters that, as of tonight, were on a precautionary federal hold and could not fly. 2 days ago, he had been the quiet mechanic who arrived before dawn and kept his head down. He closed his eyes. He slept for 4 hours, which was usually enough. The emergency board meeting was called for 9 in the morning on the 3rd day after the crash. Callan found out about it from Terry, who found out from the administrative coordinator, who had been told to prepare the main conference facility for a full board session with external counsel present, which meant the kind of meeting where decisions of significant consequence were being made by people with the authority to make them. Callan was not invited, which he had expected. He was a contract technician. Board meetings were not his environment. What he had not expected was the human resources coordinator appearing at his bench at 8:45 with the look of someone who had drawn a short straw. Her name was Jenna. She was 29, and she was conscientious, and she genuinely did not want to be doing this, which was visible in every line of her body as she stood in front of his bench with a manila folder and a carefully neutral expression. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, "I've been asked to notify you that your contract engagement with Aurelius has been placed under administrative review pending the outcome of the current investigation. Effective immediately, you're suspended from active duty assignments with full pay, pending the review completion." She handed him the folder. Callan took it, opened it. Read the 2-page document inside with the methodical attention he gave to everything he read. "This was authorized by," he said. "The COO's office," Jenna said quietly. "I'm sorry, I'm just delivering it." "I know. This isn't your doing." He looked at her. "Is this standard protocol during a federal investigation, or is this specific to my contract?" She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without answering it. "I'm not able to speak to." "That's all right," he said. "I understand." He closed the folder. He pulled his personal tools from his bench, the ones he had bought himself, that were his, not the facilities, and he put them in his case. He took Harper's photograph from where it sat against the base of his work light. He took the copy of his original safety report from his locker, which was redundant because he had copies elsewhere, but he took it anyway because he had put it there, and it was his, and he was not leaving anything that was his in this building. He walked through the hangar toward the exit. The floor was running a light shift reduced crew, several positions standing down due to the federal hold on the fleet, the whole operation running at an awkward partial capacity that felt nothing like normal. Several of the mechanics looked up as he crossed the floor. Word traveled fast in maintenance shops, they knew. Marcus Webb, a 38-year-old structural tech who had worked the executive fleet for 7 years and who had the kind of quiet decency that didn't announce itself, set down his impact wrench and stood up straight as Callan passed. He didn't say anything. Neither did the two technicians on either side of him who did the same thing, putting down their work and standing. Callan nodded at them. He kept walking. Outside, the morning was overcast, the coastal air carrying the heavy salt and rain smell of a front moving in from the southeast. He put his tool case in the back of his truck and sat in the driver's seat and looked at the facility entrance for a moment. He had known this was possible. He had known from the moment he flagged that regulator on the first morning that pushing against the direction powerful people wanted things to go carried a cost, and that the cost was often paid by the person doing the pushing rather than the people who deserved it. This was not new information. He had filed the report anyway. He drove home. Harper was at school. The house was quiet in the mid-morning way that felt different from the pre-dawn quiet, not peaceful, just empty. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the manila folder open in front of him and read it again, this time looking at specific language used to describe the grounds for review. Conduct during the pre-flight period inconsistent with contracted scope of duties. Ongoing federal investigation requiring separation of contracted personnel from facility access pending outcome determination. Inconsistent with contracted scope of duties. He had reported a safety discrepancy in an aircraft he was maintaining. That was precisely his contracted scope of duties. They knew that. The language wasn't meant to be accurate. It was meant to be documented so that if anyone asked the minute why the technician who had filed the safety report was suspended 3 days after a crash that proved him right, there was a piece of paper with a reason on it. He understood the move. He didn't respect it, but he understood it. His phone rang at 10:40. Sabine, they suspended you, she said. An hour ago, I heard. A pause. They didn't suspend me. Which I've been thinking about since I heard. You're a full-time employee with 6 years of tenure and professional regulatory standing. Suspending you would draw more attention than keeping you in place. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. What happened in the board meeting? He heard her move, the sound of a door closing, footsteps, the quality of ambient noise changing to something more enclosed. She was finding privacy. Sterling presented first, she said. I got this from someone in the room afterward, someone who was there in a legal capacity and was not comfortable with what they witnessed. A breath. He framed the crash as a consequence of a maintenance failure at the technician level. He acknowledged the procurement concerns, but characterized them as a supply chain oversight issue that his division had been in the process of addressing. He presented a document. What document? An incident report from your military service. A crash investigation. He said it showed a pattern that you had a history of aviation accidents connected to decisions made under your command. Callan was still. He had known this was in his record. He had known it would surface eventually, if anyone looked hard enough. He had not known Sterling had it, which meant Sterling had been looking not recently, not as a reaction to the crash, but before. Background research on people he considered potential problems, kept ready for use when needed. What was the board's response? Callan said, mixed. Several members were clearly disturbed by it. Some pushed back, asked about the evidence package. Sabine asked about the evidence I had filed with federal investigators. Sterling acknowledged it and said the federal process would determine what was valid, but that in the interim the board had a responsibility to protect the company's workforce and contracts, was ensuring the narrative around the crash was managed carefully. Managed carefully. The phrasing had weight. He gave them someone, Callan said. Yes, Sabine said. He gave them you. Contract tech with an imperfect military record who was connected to the aircraft, who had filed a report, but who had ultimately not prevented the flight. He made it sound almost reasonable. Her voice tightened. And then the board voted to formally suspend your contract pending investigation. Did Evelina vote? The pause lasted 3 seconds, which was 1 second longer than comfortable. She was there, Sabine said. She voted with the rest. Callan said nothing. He looked at the wall of his kitchen. At Harper's school calendar, pinned next to the phone charger, the dates of her track meets marked in red marker. At the photograph on the counter, Harper at 10, Callan holding her up to see something over a crowd, both of them laughing at something that had already been forgotten, but the laugh was still there, frozen in the glossy paper. He thought about the executive pad, about pulling Evelina Thorne through a burning aircraft with his knee bleeding into his boot, about her voice on the phone saying, "Trust me," about things not looking like what you'd expect. He thought about that. "Callan," Sabine said carefully. "I'm here. I don't think she stopped." Chose again. "I'm not sure the vote tells the whole story." "Maybe not," he said. And then, because it was true regardless of everything else, the 11 components. The fleet hold. That's still in place? Federal confirmed this morning. No aircraft moves until they've done a full review of every unit in the procurement chain. That's solid. That doesn't change based on what the board does with personnel. Good, he said. That's the part that matters. You matter, Sabine said, with the bluntness of someone who didn't usually talk like that and was pushing past their own discomfort to say it. Thank you, he said. Keep me informed. He ended the call. He sat with the quiet of the house and the coffee that had gone cold and the folder with its carefully worded language, and he let himself feel what he felt for a few minutes without trying to manage it. Not rage, he didn't have the luxury of rage, and rage wasn't useful anyway. Something closer to a tired, grinding disappointment. Not in Evelina specifically. In the reliability of the pattern, the moment institutional pressure became acute. The people who had the most to lose looked for someone with the least protection and offered them up. He had been that person before. Different circumstances, same math. He pulled out his phone and called Ronan Vale. Vale picked up on the first ring, which meant he had been expecting the call or something like it. I heard, Vale said. Word travels. I have contacts at the facility, and I've been paying attention since the crash. A pause.
You doing all right?
I'm fine. Harper's fine. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. The incident report. From the teller extraction mission. Do you know if Sterling Bancroft's office requested my military file? The silence on Vale's end was the kind that meant he was deciding what he could say. There was a records inquiry, Vale said finally. About 6 weeks ago. Came through a defense industry security clearance verification channel, the kind that companies with federal contracts use for personnel checks. Routine looking from the outside, 6 weeks ago, Callan said. Before the crash, Vale confirmed. So Sterling had known who Callan was or had been trying to find out weeks before the helicopter went down. The background research had not been reactive. It had been precautionary. Sterling had looked at his contract roster at some point and seen a name that prompted a question, and he had quietly gone looking for an answer, and he had kept what he found in a file, ready. What that told Callan was that Sterling was careful. Careful people were harder to destroy carelessly. The teller mission, Callan said. The incident report. You were there. I was. You know what actually happened. I know exactly what happened, Vale said, and his voice had a quality to it that was not comfortable the weight of something that had been carried a long time and not gotten lighter. You took responsibility for Reyes's call, because Reyes had a wife and a 2-month-old at home, and his career would have been finished. You didn't know Kessler was going to pull the investigation in the direction he pulled it. You thought it would end with a reprimand. It ended with a resignation, Callan said.
Yes.
It did. Another pause. I've thought about that often. Don't, Callan said. It was my choice. I knew the risk. I could provide a statement. To the federal investigators or to the board. I was present. I can document what the incident report doesn't say. Callan was quiet for a moment. Not yet, he said. Hold that. Why? He thought about Evelina on the phone. About trust. About things not looking like what you'd expect. He thought about whether he was giving her too much credit or exactly the right amount, and he recognized he couldn't know for certain, and that uncertainty was going to have to be manageable for now. Because the situation might not be what it looks like, he said, and I want to be sure before I deploy resources I can't take back. Vale understood that language. I'll hold, he said. But Callan, don't give too much benefit of the doubt to someone who let you walk out of a building today. I know, Callan said. I hear you. He ended the call. He spent the rest of the morning and the early afternoon at his kitchen table, working through the Meridian Capital Partners ownership chain with the same systematic attention he had given the maintenance records. He wasn't a financial analyst and he didn't pretend to be, but he could follow a document trail and he could identify when information was structured to obscure rather than clarify, and the structure he was looking at was built specifically to obscure. Layered entities, nominee directors in 2 of the intermediate companies, the beneficial ownership disclosure buried in an amendment filing that had been submitted on a Friday afternoon in November. He found the financial authorizations at 3 in the afternoon. They were not procurement records. Those were already in the evidence package Sabine had built. These were internal financial approvals, the documents within Aurelius's own system that authorized payment to Trident Dynamics for each contract. Each approval bore a digital signature. Each signature belonged to Sterling Bancroft, not Holt, not an intermediary. Sterling himself, personally authorizing payment to a supplier in which his family trust held beneficial ownership, without disclosure to the board or the company's conflict of interest compliance function. Callan photographed the screen, added it to his encrypted drive, sent a copy to Sabine with a one-line message, found the authorization signatures. Sterling signed every payment personally. Her response came back in under 2 minutes. Outside counsel already has them. We found the same source this morning. Federal investigators have been notified. He sat back. The picture was complete now. Not complicated, never actually complicated once you removed the layers designed to make it look that way. Sterling Bancroft had built a relationship between his company and a supplier in which he held a hidden financial interest. He had allowed safety concerns to be suppressed to protect the flow of that business. He had knowingly permitted defective components into an aircraft fleet that carried people, including his own CEO, because the money was good and the risk of detection was low, and he had enough institutional authority to keep inconvenient questions from becoming answers. It wasn't passion or ideology or desperation. It was just money. It was the oldest and most reliable kind of corruption there was. And when it started to collapse, he had done what people like Sterling always did, found the person with the least protection in the room, and handed them to the crowd. The afternoon was moving toward evening. Harper would be home in an hour. Callan stood up from the table, stretched his back, and looked around the kitchen at the calendar, with the track meets in red, at the photograph on the counter, at the ordinary accumulated evidence of a life that was small and deliberate and worth protecting. He was washing the coffee cups when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. No text this time, a call. He answered it. The voice on the other end was male, older, with the flat regional accent of someone who had grown up in the mid-Atlantic states and had spent years trying to smooth it out without quite succeeding. Mr. Whitlock, the voice said, my name is not important. What I can tell you is that I work in this company's finance function, and I have worked here for 9 years, and I have been aware of the Trident arrangement for approximately 8 months. Callan said nothing. He let the man continue. I didn't say anything, the voice said, because I have a family, and because the people involved have a great deal of power inside this organization, and because I told myself it was a regulatory matter that would eventually surface through proper channels. A beat. It did not surface through proper channels. It went through a helicopter instead. What do you want to tell me? Callan said. I want to tell you that there are 3 additional financial authorization records that are not in the procurement system. They're in a separate internal budget tracking file that sits in the CFO's division, not the COO's. The file is called Apex Operational Reserve. Sterling has authorization to access it, but it reports to the CFO, who I believe does not know what it contains. What does it contain? Payments, the voice said. To Holt. Direct payments disguised as consulting fees going back 13 months. Payments for what I believe is his cooperation in maintaining the certification approval process. Callan pressed the phone closer to his ear. Are you able to document this? I have already documented it. I sent a copy to the federal investigation team this afternoon through a whistleblower submission channel. I am telling you because you were suspended today, and I believe you deserve to know that the picture is larger than what you can see from where you're standing. The call ended. Callan stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and the fading afternoon light coming through the window above the sink. Holt, the division safety coordinator who had been closing out safety flags from a director-level login. 13 months of payments disguised as consulting fees. The mechanism by which a corporate officer's instructions were translated into action at the operational level, made sustainable through money rather than mere compliance. Sterling had not just built a financial arrangement. He had built a system. He had identified the person whose cooperation he needed, and he had purchased it. And the purchased cooperation had run quietly for over a year, while aircraft flew with components that had no business being in them. The front door opened. Harper came in with her backpack on one shoulder and her cleats in her hand. She'd had practice. And she looked at her father standing in the kitchen with his phone and whatever was on his face. And she stopped. What happened? She said. She was 13, and she was sharp, and she had inherited her mother's precise instinct for when something was wrong. I got put on suspension from the job, he said, while they investigate the crash. She looked at him for a long moment. He watched her process, at the quick intelligence behind her eyes, running through implications, checking his face for what he wasn't saying. Is it because you tried to stop the helicopter? She said. He looked at his daughter. Something like that, he said. She set her cleats down carefully on the mat by the door. She came into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, because she was always hungry after practice, and she stood there looking at its contents with her back to him. Are you going to be okay? She said to the refrigerator. Yes, he said. Are you actually okay? Or are you doing the thing where you say you're okay because you don't want me to worry? He almost smiled. Some of both. She pulled out leftover pasta from 2 nights ago and put it on the counter and turned to look at him directly, the way she did when she had decided she was done letting him manage the distance between them. You didn't do anything wrong, she said. It was not a question. No, he said, I didn't. Then it'll come out right, she said, with the blunt confidence of a 13-year-old, who believed this because her father had always modeled it for her, and who did not yet fully understand how often it failed to be true, and whose belief in it right now was the most valuable thing in the room. He nodded. He helped her heat up the pasta. They ate together at the kitchen table, and Harper talked about her practice and the coach, who had finally moved her to the position she'd been asking for. And Callan listened and asked the right questions, and was entirely present in the way that the last several days had made difficult, and that he was making a conscious choice to manage. After dinner, she went to do homework. He sat at the table with his encrypted drive and his documentation and his cold coffee. At 9:15 that evening, he received a text from Sabine. Board is meeting again tomorrow morning. Early. Something's changed. He read it twice. Then he put his phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the dark marsh, where the night herons would be moving through the grass, and the tide would be doing whatever it was going to do, regardless of what happened inside any building anywhere, and where the world continued in its ordinary mechanical way, without caring about the particular cruelties and corrections of the people living on top of it. He thought about Evelina Thorne, sitting in that board meeting and voting with the rest of them. He thought about what she had said. Trust me. He had trusted people before at cost to himself. He picked up his phone and looked at Sabine's text again. Something's changed. He didn't write back. There was nothing useful he could say from here, tonight, with the information he had. He would find out tomorrow what kind of change it was, and what it meant, and what came next. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to check that Harper's light was out, which it wasn't, which meant she had fallen asleep with a book again. So he went in quietly and took the book from her hands and marked the page and turned off her lamp and stood there in the dark of her room for a moment, listening to her breathe. She was fine. As long as she was fine, the rest of it was manageable. He went to bed. The second board meeting started at 7 in the morning, which meant it had been called late enough the previous evening that some members had driven through the dark to get there, and early enough that Sterling Bancroft would have assumed he was controlling the schedule. Callan found out it had begun from Sabine's text at 7:08. It started. She came in person. He was already awake. He had been awake since 5, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and his documentation, and the particular stillness of a man who has done everything within his reach and has arrived at the part where the outcome belongs to forces he cannot directly control. It was not a comfortable place to be. He had never found it comfortable. He had simply learned, over years and difficult circumstances, that discomfort and helplessness were not the same thing, and that mistaking one for the other was how people made bad decisions in the final moments of things. He waited. Harper came down at 7:30 in her school clothes, poured cereal, and looked at him across the kitchen counter with the careful assessment she had been running on him for the past 2 days. You didn't sleep much, she said. I slept enough. That's not what I said. He looked at his daughter. She had her mother's directness, that quality of looking at something and naming it without dressing it up, which had been one of the things he loved most about her mother, and which he found, in Harper, both familiar and occasionally difficult to be on the receiving end of. No, he said, I didn't sleep much. She ate her cereal. She didn't push further, because she knew him well enough to know when further wasn't going to produce anything useful. That restraint, knowing when to stop, was something she had developed on her own. He wasn't sure he could take credit for it. Whatever happens today, she said, not looking up from her bowl, you still have to pick me up at 4. I have a makeup lab. I know, he said. Just making sure you have priorities straight. He did almost smile at that. She left at 7:50. He watched her walk down the driveway to the corner where the bus stopped, backpack bouncing, not looking back the way teenagers didn't look back, operating on the reasonable assumption that the world behind them would still be there when they chose to turn around. He hoped she was right about that for a long time. His phone rang at 8:43. It was Sabine, and she was not texting this time because what she had to say was too compressed and too immediate for a text. "You need to understand what just happened," she said, and her voice had the controlled quality of someone running a very large amount of adrenaline through a very practiced professional filter. "Tell me." Sterling presented his case to the board. Same framework as yesterday: crash as technician-level failure, procurement as oversight issue, your military record, the whole package. He was organized. He had documents, he had talking points, he had answers ready for the pushback questions. She paused. He was good. He almost held it. "Almost," Callan said. Evelina let him finish. She sat there at that table, and she let him say every single thing he had prepared to say, and she did not interrupt him once, and she did not challenge a single point while he was speaking. When he was done, she asked him directly, "Were you aware of any financial relationship between entities under your control and the Trident Dynamic supply chain?" Another pause. Shorter. He said no. Callan understood then what Evelina had been doing. What she had needed from the board meeting 2 days ago: Sterling's confidence, Sterling's lie told completely, and in front of witnesses, Sterling on record. She was waiting for him to commit to the denial, Callan said. In front of 8 board members, outside counsel, and a court reporter she had brought in that morning without telling anyone except the board chair, who she had briefed the previous evening. Sabine's voice had something in it that was not quite admiration and not quite relief, but was made of both. The moment he said no, she presented the procurement records, the certification anomalies, Holt's approval trail, the Meridian ownership structure, the beneficial ownership filing, and every payment authorization Sterling had signed personally. She put it all on the screen in the order that told the story most clearly, and she walked through it without rushing, and she let the board understand what they were looking at before she said another word. Callan was standing now. He didn't remember standing up. Then she pulled the financial records from Apex Operational Reserve. Sabine continued. Holt's payments. 13 months of them. She put Sterling's name beside every authorization and the date beside every safety flag that was subsequently closed without review. And she showed the board the direct correspondence between the two timelines. How did Sterling respond? He didn't. Not coherently. He said the documents were being mischaracterized, that there were legitimate business explanations, that outside counsel needed to review the full context. He used the word context 4 times in about 90 seconds. A beat. Nobody at the table was looking at him by the end. Callan sat back down. He put his elbow on the table and his hand over his eyes for a moment, not from distress but from the particular physical weight of tension that had been held for several days, beginning, incrementally, to release. The board voted to place Sterling on immediate administrative suspension, pending a full forensic audit and referral to federal investigators, Sabine said. The vote was 8-0. He was escorted from the building by facility security at 8:31 this morning. She stopped. Callan, your suspension has been formally rescinded. The board resolution includes statement that your safety report was accurate, timely, and properly filed, and that its suppression represents a critical failure of the company's compliance infrastructure. He sat with that for a moment. Not with triumph. He didn't feel triumph exactly. Something more complicated. The particular feeling of a thing that was right, finally being acknowledged as right, which should have been uncomplicated, but never was, because the space between when it should have happened and when it actually happened was filled with damage that acknowledgement didn't undo. Darius Cole had 2 broken ribs and a fractured clavicle. That was still true. That would still be true after every board resolution ever written. The fleet hold, he said, stays in place until federal completes their component review. Evelina has committed to full cooperation and has already authorized Aurelius Resources to assist the investigation rather than manage around it. Sabine's voice shifted slightly. She wants to talk to you. I imagine she does. Are you angry with her? He thought about the question honestly. About sitting at his kitchen table the previous evening looking at the wall with the calendar and Harper's track meets in red. About the long, quiet understanding that the vote had been part of something he hadn't been fully read into, and about whether that made it forgivable or merely explicable. Not angry, he said. I need her to explain it to me directly. Not because I need the apology. Because if I'm going to work with someone, I need to know how they think. Sabine was quiet for a moment. She said you'd say something like that. Did she? She said. And this is close to direct that you were the most frustratingly unsurprisable person she had encountered in this industry. He almost smiled again. Tell her I'm at home. She knows where to find me. Evelina Thorne arrived at his front door at 11:15, alone, driving herself in a car that was not a company vehicle. She was in clothes that were closer to what he imagined she wore when she wasn't being a CEO, dark jeans, a plain sweater, flat boots. There was still visible bruising along her right temple from the crash, a greenish-yellow sprawl that makeup had not entirely covered. She moved carefully, with the deliberate quality of someone whose ribs were informing every step that they were not yet fully reconciled to normal function. She stood on his porch and looked at him with the direct, slightly uncomfortable expression of someone who was not accustomed to owing explanations to people and who had decided to give one anyway. "Can I come in?" she said. He stepped back from the door. She came inside and looked at the kitchen, the ordinary kitchen of a man who lived carefully within his means, nothing staged or curated. Harper's cereal bowl still in the drying rack, and she sat down at the table when he gestured toward a chair, and she put her hands flat on the table and looked at him. "I need to explain the board meeting," she said. "You don't have to," he said. "I understand the tactical logic. I know you understand the tactical logic." She held his gaze. "I want to explain why I didn't warn you. Why I let you walk out of that building with your tools and your daughter's photograph, and I sat there and said nothing." He sat down across from her. He waited. "Because Sterling had people watching your communications," she said. "He had someone with access to the facility's internal network flagging activity from your work accounts. And I believe, though I can't yet prove that he had someone monitoring activity associated with your personal phone as well. If I had warned you, he would have known I had warned you. And if he had known I had warned you, he would have pulled back from the board presentation. And I would have lost the moment I needed him to commit to the denial on record." She paused. "I needed him arrogant enough to lie completely. The only way to keep him arrogant was to let him believe he had won." Callan looked at her. "You used me as part of the setup," he said. "Yes. No softening, no qualification. I made a calculation that the outcome justified what I was asking you to absorb in the interim. I knew you could handle it. That's not an apology for making the calculation, it's an acknowledgement that I made it, and that I made it about you, without your knowledge or consent." He looked at his hands on the table, at the grease lines that never entirely washed out of the creases of his knuckles that had been there so long they were part of what his hands looked like. "Did you know about the Trident arrangement before the crash?" he said. "No. Flat and immediate. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I had no knowledge of Sterling's financial interest in the Trident supply chain before the crash. I had concerns about the pace of the Trident contract approvals. They moved faster than our standard vendor qualification process. But Sterling gave me a credible operational explanation, and I accepted it." Something moved through her expression that was not comfortable. "I should have pushed harder. That's mine." He appreciated the precision. She could have given him a cleaner version of her own role. It would have been easy. He would have had no way to check it immediately. She didn't. "The vote," he said. "The vote was what it had to be," she said. "I needed Sterling to see the board behind him. I needed him relaxed enough to come back the next morning and lie to the same room. If I had defended you at that meeting, he would have known something was coming." She looked at him steadily. "I also want you to know that the board resolution you received this morning was not a formality. I wrote the language myself. I wanted it to be precise." He nodded. "There's something else," she said. "All right." She reached into the bag she had brought and set a document on the table between them. Not a suspension notice this time, a different kind of document entirely. A formal offer of employment. Full-time Aurelius staff, not contract. The title at the top of the page read Director of Aviation Safety. He looked at it without picking it up. "This position doesn't currently exist," she said. "I'm creating it. The Director of Aviation Safety would hold independent authority over the fleet certification process, not advisory authority. Actual authority. The ability to ground an aircraft. The ability to order a component review. The ability to reject a vendor relationship that doesn't meet safety criteria, without requiring sign-off from financial or operational leadership." She paused. No one in a finance or operations role would have override authority over a safety determination. That would be written into the corporate charter. Callan looked at the document. He thought about the morning 3 days ago when he had arrived at his bench at 5:40 and found a hydraulic pressure regulator with an impossible test timeline and a serial number that returned nothing in any database. He thought about what it had cost to do the straightforward and necessary thing. "There are 3 conditions," he said. She looked at him. "Tell me." Any employee who was pressured into silence during the Trident period, anyone who knew something was wrong and felt they couldn't say so without consequence, no disciplinary action. The investigation establishes what happened, but the people on the floor who were managed into compliance don't carry the weight of decisions that were made above them. Evelina nodded. Agreed. Safety Verification Authority is structurally independent from financial performance metrics. No safety reviewer's position or compensation can be tied to production throughput, delivery timelines, or cost management outcomes. Those are separate functions, and they stay separate. Agreed, she said again. Every technician in this facility, from the lowest paid contract worker to the director, has the explicit documented right to ground an aircraft they believe is unsafe, without fear of retaliation, and that right is not a policy statement in an employee handbook. It's a written protection with teeth. Anyone who retaliates against a safety report faces automatic termination review, regardless of their level. Evelina was quiet for a moment. Not because she was hesitating, he could see she wasn't hesitating. She was doing what she apparently did, which was absorb a thing completely before she responded to it. All 3, she said. I'll have legal draft the specific language this week. You review it before anything is finalized. He looked at the offer letter on the table. Then he picked it up. He read it the way he read everything start to finish, every line, no skipping. It took 4 minutes. Evelina sat across from him and waited without filling the silence, which he appreciated more than he would have said. He set it back down. I'll need to talk to Harper, he said. Evelina blinked. He suspected she had been expecting a direct yes or a negotiation, not a 13-year-old being part of the decision. Of course, she said. She has opinions about my work schedule, he said. They're relevant. Something crossed Evelina's face that was not quite a smile, more like a recognition. The kind of expression that appeared when a person encountered a set of priorities that reordered their assumptions about someone. Take the time you need, she said. She left 20 minutes later. He walked her to her car, and she paused at the driver's door and looked at him with the afternoon light coming in flat from the east and the marsh smell strong in the air from the tide that was moving in. I owe Darius Cole an apology, she said. It came out like something she had been holding for a while. Not a company statement, a personal one. He made a decision out there that saved lives, and he did it alone, and he's going to spend months recovering. He'll want to hear it from you directly, Callan said. He's not someone who values the formal version. How do you know what he values? You've worked beside him for 2 years, and you never said more than 20 words at a time. You can know a lot about a person from 20 words, Callan said, if you're paying attention to the right things. She looked at him for a moment. Then she got in the car. He stood on the porch and watched her drive away. The federal investigation ran for 11 weeks. It was not tidy, and it was not fast, and it involved more lawyers and more document requests, and more difficult conversations than any process that ran to schedule ever did. The forensic audit of Aurelius's procurement function turned up additional irregularities beyond the Trident arrangement, smaller, older. Most of them the accumulated carelessness of an oversight culture that had been degrading quietly for years before Sterling Bancroft made it into something actively corrupt. Sterling himself was indicted on 4 counts, including securities fraud and deliberate endangerment through regulatory noncompliance. His attorney gave a statement characterizing the charges as a misreading of standard business practice. The federal prosecutor gave a different statement that was shorter and more precise. The process would take time, these things always took time, but the documentation was thorough, and the financial trail was direct, and the court reporter who had been in the boardroom when Sterling said no on record had clean, time-stamped transcripts of everything that followed. Holt cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge arrangement. His cooperation produced 3 additional individuals within Aurelius's extended vendor management structure who had been involved in the approval process, none of them at the level of direct financial culpability that Holt carried, but all of them part of the system that had kept the arrangement running. All 11 compromised components were replaced. The 2 aircraft that had been scheduled to fly within days of the fleet, hold one a corporate transport, one a contracted government flight, never left the ground. No one else was hurt. That was the part Callan came back to when the weight of everything else got heavy. No one else got hurt. The margin had been close enough, and the documentation showed it clearly enough that he did not need to dramatize it for himself. The hydraulic system on the second grounded aircraft showed the same failure pattern as AUR-7's regulator at an earlier stage of progression. Given the length of the scheduled flight, the calculation was not good. He did not think about that calculation for long. Thinking about it for long wasn't useful. Darius Cole spent 6 weeks recovering, went through physical therapy that he described, in the single conversation Callan had with him during that period, as the most humiliating experience of his professional life, and returned to the facility in the 8th week, walking without assistance and looking for something to do. Aurelius offered him a ground-based role in flight operations training, which he accepted with the manner of a man who was not entirely sure how he felt about it, but who was pragmatic enough to understand that his body was currently casting a vote he couldn't override. Evelina went to see him personally during his 3rd week of recovery, alone, no staff. Whatever was said in that conversation was between the two of them. Darius told Callan afterward only that she had been straight with him, which from Darius was the highest available commendation. Sabine Mercer was named head of the newly created independent safety verification function, reporting directly to the board rather than to any operational division. She took the role with the matter-of-fact manner of someone who had been doing the work for years and was mildly irritated that it had taken a disaster to create the structure around it. She and Callan disagreed regularly about methodology and approach and the specific language of safety protocols, which was precisely the dynamic that good safety systems required, and which both of them understood well enough to keep productive. Callan started in the director role on a Monday morning in early spring, 6 weeks after the board meeting. He drove to the facility the same way he always had, same route, same time, same nod to Phil at the east gate, who had by this point clearly heard everything about everything but maintained his habitual expression of mild sleep deprivation and said nothing beyond the nod, which Callan respected. His office was new, an actual office, with a door, which he found slightly uncomfortable in the way that enclosed spaces always made him slightly uncomfortable after years of preferring open ground. He kept the door open. The first thing he did in the role, before any meetings or briefings or orientation sessions, was walk the hangar floor. He walked it the way he had always walked it as a technician, slowly, looking at what was actually there rather than at what the documentation said should be there, stopping when something didn't look right, asking the people working around him what they were seeing and what they weren't sure about, and whether there was anything they had been meaning to flag. 3 technicians flagged things that morning. Small things: a maintenance log discrepancy, an ambiguous inspection result that had been carried forward rather than resolved, a supplier substitution that had been approved verbally without written documentation. None of them were safety critical in isolation. All of them were the kind of thing that, in a culture that had been degrading quietly for years, accumulated into the conditions that made disasters possible. He documented all 3. He made sure the technicians who raised them knew their names were being recorded as having done the right thing, not as having created problems. Word moved through the maintenance floor the way word always moved, sideways and fast, floor to floor, shift to shift. By the end of the first week, more people were talking. Not because Callan had given a speech or held a meeting or posted a values statement, because the people on the floor had seen what happened when someone flagged a problem and been ignored, and now they were watching to see whether the new system was different or whether it was the same system with different language painted over it. It took time. Trust in institutions once broken did not return because the institution announced it was trustworthy. It returned through accumulated, specific, unremarkable acts of actually being trustworthy. A report filed on Tuesday, reviewed and responded to by Friday with the reviewer's name attached. A safety hold respected even when it delayed a flight that someone above the floor wanted to happen. A technician told directly and without hedging, "You were right to flag this. Here's what we found. Here's what we're doing about it." Small things. Repeated, consistently. It was not dramatic work. He preferred it that way. Evelina changed, but not in the direction that stories about powerful people usually moved. She did not become softer or more sentimental or suddenly interested in the humanity of people she had previously overlooked. She became more precise. She started visiting the maintenance floor twice a month without announcement, without an entourage, wearing the same visitor's vest that anyone got at the East Gate, And she asked specific questions and expected specific answers. And when she didn't get them, she came back until she did. She learned the names of the people on the floor. Not as a management exercise, she learned them the way you learned them when you were actually paying attention. When you started to understand that the person who signed their initials to a maintenance log was not an abstraction, but a specific human being with specific knowledge who was, every time they did their job correctly, keeping other people alive. She and Callan had a working relationship that was professional and occasionally difficult and productive in the specific way that productive things were. Not because the process was easy, but because both people involved were committed to the outcome being right rather than to the conversation being comfortable. She trusted him. He trusted her, with the specific qualified trust of someone who understood that trust was not a permanent condition, but an ongoing determination renewed by accumulated evidence. The evidence kept accumulating. He kept renewing it. One afternoon in October, 7 months after the crash, Ronan Vale brought a Navy inspection team through the Aurelius facility. It was a standard defense contractor compliance review, nothing extraordinary, the kind of visit that happened twice a year. But Vale ran it personally, which was a level of seniority that the routine visit didn't strictly require. Callan was on the floor when they arrived, working alongside the inspection team on a documentation review of the hydraulic certification process that Aurelius had rebuilt from the procedural level up. He was in his work coat, the same kind of coat he had worn as a contract tech, with the same oil stain resistance and the same unremarkable practicality, because he had never seen the point of dressing a maintenance floor job as something other than a maintenance floor job. Vale's team moved through the facility with the methodical efficiency of people who knew what they were looking for and had done this many times. A young petty officer, 22, maybe 23, with the careful attentiveness of someone who was still learning how to carry their authority without either shrinking from it or overclaiming, it was assigned to shadow Vale through the inspection. At one point, the young petty officer watched Vale stop in front of Callan to ask a question about a parts documentation procedure. He watched this. Vale listen to the answer with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely receiving information rather than waiting for his turn to speak. And then, when the conversation was done and Callan turned back to the documentation table, the petty officer watched Vale's posture shift barely perceptible into something that was not subordinate exactly, but was fundamentally respectful in a way that didn't match the org chart. The young petty officer fell into step beside Vale as they moved to the next section. "Master Chief," he said, keeping his voice low, "that man in the work coat, what about him?" "You called him, sir." Vale didn't look back. "I did. He's the Director of Aviation Safety." "That's a civilian role." "It is." So why Vale stopped walking. He looked at the petty officer, with the particular expression of a man who had been deciding for a moment whether to explain something or simply let it stand as observation. "The rank tells you where a person sits in a structure," Vale said. "It doesn't tell you anything else." He looked across the hangar to where Callan was, back at the documentation table, talking to one of the technicians, pointing at something on a form, and waiting, while the technician looked at it and understood it. Some people, the structure is the thing. Take the rank away, and there's nothing underneath it. He paused. And some people, the structure was just the frame. The thing underneath it was always there. The petty officer looked across the hangar. So the rank he started. The rank belonged to the uniform, Vale said. Leadership belonged to the man. He started walking again. On the far side of the hangar, Evelina had come in through the east entrance for her monthly floor visit. She was close enough to have heard Vale's words, or at least some of them, and she stood for a moment at the edge of the floor, looking across the organized activity of people doing careful, unglamorous, essential work. She looked at Callan. He was talking to a 26-year-old technician named Rosa, who had been working at Aurelius for 8 months, and who had, 3 weeks earlier, filed her first formal safety flag on a fastener inspection discrepancy that had been passed over in 2 previous checks. The flag had been valid. The discrepancy had been corrected. Rosa had been told directly that she had done exactly the right thing. She was asking Callan something now. Evelina was too far to hear the words, and he was answering with the patient, specific attention he brought to everything, not performing patience, but genuinely giving the answer the time it required. Evelina watched him and thought about the executive pad, 3 seconds before she had gotten on a helicopter she should never have boarded. She thought about what she had not seen when she looked at the quiet contract technician who had tried to stop her, and about what that failure of attention had nearly cost. She had been good at her job before the crash. She believed that honestly. She had understood numbers and strategy and the mechanics of institutional power with a facility that had taken years to build. What she had not understood, not really, not in her body, was what it meant that the people whose names she didn't know were the ones keeping every aircraft in her fleet airborne. That the work being done at 5:40 in the morning by someone who drove a 10-year-old truck and kept a photograph of his kid at his bench was, in the most direct and unmetaphorical sense, the foundation that everything she built sat on. She understood it now. She walked onto the floor. Later that evening, well after the inspection team had cleared out and the day shift had turned over and the facilities settled into the quieter rhythm of the overnight crew, Callan gathered his things from the documentation table and said good night to the two technicians who were still finishing paperwork and walked through the hangar toward the east exit. He stopped at the aircraft nearest the door, one of the executive fleet helicopters, now fully recertified under the new component verification protocol. Its documentation clean and complete and traceable to every part from every supplier in the chain. He put his hand flat against the fuselage. The metal was cool under his palm. The aircraft was solid and quiet, and as best as any human process could determine sound. He stood there for a moment with his hand against it, in the way that people who work with machines for a long time sometimes touched them, not sentiment exactly, more like confirmation. Like checking that a thing was still real. Around him, the hangar settled. Someone laughed at something on the far side of the floor. A piece of equipment moved. The ventilation system made its usual ambient noise. He took his hand off the fuselage. He looked at the mechanics still at their stations, 3 of them visible from where he stood, working with the focused, unremarkable dedication of people doing jobs that the world depended on, without ever being asked to think too hard about that dependence. All right, he said, not to anyone specifically, or maybe to all of them, and to the aircraft, and to the accumulated weight of everything the past 7 months had been. Let's make sure everyone gets home. He walked out through the east exit. His truck was in the usual spot near the gate. He drove the usual route home through the dark, with the windows down because the October air off the marsh was cool and clean and worth having on your face. He thought about nothing in particular. He let the road be just the road. Harper was on the porch when he pulled in, which she almost never was at this hour. She was usually inside, doing homework or on her phone or managing the complex social architecture of being 13 in a way that he observed from a respectful distance and occasionally tried to understand. She was sitting on the porch steps, with her arms around her knees, looking at the sky, which was doing something worth looking at. The cloud cover had broken in patches, and the stars were visible in the gaps, with the particular intensity they had near the coast, where there was enough open water to keep the light pollution honest. She heard the truck and looked over. "You're late," she said. "Inspection day. It ran long. Is that the Navy people?" "Navy people," he confirmed, coming up the walk. "Also a lot of paperwork." "Was Master Chief Vale there?" He looked at his daughter. "How do you know about Vale?" "He called the house last month," she said. "When you were at work. He wanted to make sure we were doing okay." She looked back at the sky. "He seems like a good person." Callan sat down on the steps beside her. They looked at the sky together for a moment. The marsh was making its night sounds, the particular combination of water and wind and wildlife that was specific to this coast, and that Callan had come to think of, without having ever consciously decided to, as the sound of home. "Dad," Harper said. "Yeah, are you staying? At this job?" He thought about it, the honest version, not the management version. "Yes," he said, "I think I am." She nodded slowly. "Good." She pulled her knees closer to her chest. "I looked up what happened. After the crash, what you found, all of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you know it was going to cost you that much when you filed that first report?" "I knew it might. But you did it anyway." "Yes." She thought about that for long enough that he didn't try to fill the space. Mom used to say she started, and then stopped in the careful way she always stopped when she brought her mother into a conversation, managing the entry point. She used to say that the thing about you was that you never seemed to think about the cost first, that you just did what needed doing and figured out the cost after. He looked at his daughter, at the girl who carried her mother's directness and her own particular intelligence and 13 years of watching him navigate a world that did not always make navigation simple. "She made it sound like a flaw," Harper said. "A little bit." She said it also. "I don't know. I'm not sure it is a flaw." "Sometimes it is," he said honestly. Harper looked at him. But not this time. He looked at the sky, at the stars through the gaps in the cloud cover steady and specific and indifferent to everything happening beneath them in the particular way that made them both humbling and somehow reassuring. "No," he said. "Not this time." They sat on the porch for a while longer, not saying much, which was one of the things Callan had always valued about Harper. She had never needed to fill silence, had understood from very young that sitting beside someone without talking was its own kind of companionship. She had gotten that from her mother, too. Eventually she got cold and went inside. He stayed on the steps a few more minutes. The marsh sound moved around him, and the stars stayed where they were, and somewhere on the water, something made a sound he didn't have a name for. The truth was, and he had spent months arriving at a way to say this to himself, that felt accurate rather than convenient, that the thing he had walked away from 4 years ago had never been the work. He had walked away from the version of the work that required him to be somewhere his daughter could not follow, doing things she could never know about, in service of a mission that was real and important, and that had also, at a specific point in time, demanded a sacrifice he was no longer willing to make. He had not known when he took the contract tech job at Aurelius that it would become this. You never knew that in advance. You just did the work as carefully as you could, and you filed the reports that needed filing, and you trusted not blindly, not without evidence, but with the specific practical trust of someone who had decided that the alternative was worse, that doing the right thing in the small daily moments was how larger outcomes were eventually determined. It was not a philosophy he had read anywhere. It was just what he had found to be true. He went inside. He checked that Harper had finished her homework, which she had, mostly. He made sure her track bag was by the door for morning, which it wasn't, so he put it there. He turned off the lights she had left on in 3 rooms, which was a number that had not decreased meaningfully since she was 8 years old. He went to bed. He slept well.